Hey, welcome to Blender Tutor. I'm Tom, and today we're going to be creating this looping donut animation I created using displacement modifiers and some animated texture nodes in cycles. Let's get started. So let's get rid of some stuff here, clean up the scene, and the first thing we're going to do is bring in a torus. And you can come down here and we're going to edit it a little bit. So the major radius 1 meter is fine. I'm gonna bring this up, this minor radius up to like 0.8, maybe a little too much. I want it to be a pretty fat donut. Let's try like 0.75, maybe even just a little less. Let's do 0.6. Yeah, that looks good. So that is our basic shape, but let's give it a little more resolution. So we have 48 segments going around it, but only 12 going around here. You can see all these harsh lines. So let's just bring that up to 48 also, because we're gonna need a lot of resolution for the displacement so it doesn't look too blocky. I think that should be good. So now I'm just gonna pretty much set up the camera from the beginning just so we could worry about the animation then. So I'm just going to rotate our donut. This is by no means specific. You don't need to do it to any, do it to whatever you think looks good. From the front view, by pressing 1 on your numpad, I rotated that about 45 degrees. And now if you hit RZ, you could rotate it on the Z-axis. I'll do something like that. And I'll bring in so the camera's already in the scene, but if you hit Control-Alt-0 on the numpad, it'll bring the camera to your viewpoint. And I'm just gonna go ahead and turn this into a square camera. And I think since this is already kind of a goofy looking animation, I'm gonna do a wider angle lens. Let's do like 30. If you hit N on your keyboard, it's gonna bring out this side tab, which will give us some options to move stuff around. And I could actually just scroll on the Y to bring it closer to our donut. And now that I'm a little closer, I'm just gonna readjust this a little bit. So if you select the donut and hit R twice, you could just kind of rotate it freely. I'm just gonna rotate it a little more so we could kind of see through it a little bit. I'm just gonna rename this to donut. And now let's add some modifiers. We're gonna need a subdivision surface. For viewport, I found that 3 works pretty well for the amount of displacement we're going to be doing. But to render it out, you're going to want to bring it up to like 5 or 6. I think I did 5 for my final render, but it depends on the level of displacement. Basically, the more you're altering the resolution of the mesh with the displacement, the more resolution you need so it's smoother. You'll kind of see what I mean once we start adding the displacement. I'm also just going to right click and add shade smooth real quick. So we have that. Let's add in a displacement modifier now. And by default, that just kind of blows up our donut, but that's fine for now. So yeah, we'll create a new texture, and then we could go down here to the texture properties tab. And we're going to change this type from image or movie to clouds, which will go insane. But that's fine. We just need to turn down the strength of the displacement, which we'll do in a second. I'm going to just adjust some settings real quick. So I want this to be kind of big and chunky. This is right now, it's like really tiny and stabby, which do not want. So I'm going to turn the size up to 1. And that's already looking closer to what I want. Still too strong, but good scale. For depth, I will keep that at 2, I think, and that's fine. We'll just call this texture large. So we can go back to the modifiers now and turn this strength, turn that down to a 0.4 for mid-level. I'll just keep that there. The other thing we're going to change though is instead of for coordinates, it's set to local right now, which basically means if I move this around, I think it moves with the object. So if I were to do global, as I move it around in 3D space, the displacement will change depending on where the object is. What I want is actually set to another object. And what we're going to do is we will create an empty, and let's do a circle. Go into front view. Cool. So there's our circle right there. I'm going to call this disp empty 1. So go back to our donut now, and let's choose that empty we just created. And now you can see if I move my empty, it's actually driving the movement of the displacement. And then we don't have to do anything with our actual mesh, the base mesh. So what I'm going to do is, let's actually set a few things up in the timeline. I figured out that to get this to loop perfectly, we could set it to 120 frames in the timeline. So on frame 1, let's just hit I rotation for our empty and go to let's actually go to frame 121 and we'll just rotate it fully around, full 360, I rotation again. And now you can see that is displacing our mesh. So we're getting some movement on it without actually having to do anything else. And that should loop perfectly. So that is our starting point for the donut loop. We're going to add a second displacement modifier now. So I could shrink that, add another one. I'm going to add another texture. Let's go choose our next texture. For this one, I want it to be a little bit bigger. Let's do like 1.3. And make sure, like, I'm just using the basic for noise basis. I'm using the Blender original, but there are like a bunch of different ones that get you like really crazy cool effects. So make sure to play around with those. I like how the Blender original looks for this animation, but yeah, like definitely mess around with the different options. There are so many things you could tweak in these settings. I'm going to leave everything else as it is. I might actually turn up the contrast a little. Let's just do like 1.2 just to make it kind of bulge out a little more. Go back to our displacement. I'm going to add another empty, and this time I'll do a sphere. And let's just call that disp empty 2. Go back to our donut. Change the coordinates on the displacement modifier to object again. And we'll choose that second one. So this is looking way too crazy. I'm going to turn the strength way down on this modifier to like 1.1. Maybe we'll turn that up a little bit more, 0.2. So we'll do the same thing we did with that first empty where we will animate this, but I'm going to animate it in a different rotation this time. So I'll do side profile. If you hit 3 on the numpad, we'll go to side view, and with your the second empty selected on the first frame, I rotation, go to the 121st frame, and R, let's just go full 360. And if you look in the top left corner, this is actually negative degrees. So it's negative 360. Hit I, rotation, and now you can watch that. So that's, yeah, adding some cool minor displacement to the base mesh, but the real effect we're going to be getting is from the actual material settings and cycles. This is just so it kind of adds a little more variation to the movement. I'll let that finish looping to make sure it looks good. Cool, yeah, and it does loop perfectly. So we could go on to materials next. Before we do that though, let's add an HDRI. So go to the world settings under color, environment texture. I'm going to open up an HDRI that I like. I've used for several of my tutorials now. It's going to be this Studio Small 03, which is on HDRIHaven.com. That should be linked in the description. And also go to the render settings and change it from Eevee to cycles. And if you have a GPU, make sure to turn that on. Let's see how that's looking. We haven't actually set up any materials yet, so it's not going to look particularly great right now. Let's actually go ahead and add a material real quick. And we could set 2 things right now before we even start setting up with the colors and the displacement. For specular, I'm going to actually leave that as is, 0.5. For roughness, I'm going to just bring that down to 0. I want this to be a very shiny donut. We're also going to go down to the settings all the way at the bottom. And we're going to want to turn on under displacement, it's currently set to bump only. We want to turn that to displacement and bump. We're actually not going to use bump for this texture setup, but I just usually choose them both. You could just choose displacement, and you'll see why in a second. So let's go over to the shading tab up here, and if you don't want, if like cycles is kind of slow on your computer, but you still want to preview it in the preview viewport shading, but you want to see it with your lighting, you could go ahead and add this scene world and scene lights. That way you could basically see, this won't actually have the displacement that cycles will add, but it'll still show the colors and everything else. So it's better than nothing. So let's go ahead and start adding some textures now. So if you hit Control T on the principled BSDF node, that will automatically add all these nodes for you. I'm going to go ahead and delete this image texture. We're going to bring in quite a few nodes, but for one, we're definitely going to need a color ramp. And I know we're going to be using for the texture coordinate, just change this to object. So our first texture node we're going to bring in is a Voronoi, I think that's how you say it, texture. And we're going to leave that as 3D, F1, Euclidean. We'll change the scale down to 2. And for randomness, I'm going to do a 0.25. These are all, by the way, these are all just settings I found from doing a bunch of experimentation to find what I liked, but you should experiment a little bit and see what you like, get a different look if you want. Now, to do a preview of the colors before, like we're not really worried about the full material right now. We just want to make sure the colors and pattern is looking correct. So with this color ramp, if you hit Control, Shift, and then click, it'll go into this viewer node, which will be an unshaded view of our material right now. That's kind of the best way to see what we're doing. So we're done with this one. Let's add in another texture node. This time we're going to use the Musgrave texture, and that's going to kind of bring in that circle look that I got in my final render. For this one, we're going to do the 4D, which gives us this extra parameter, this W, that we are able to animate, and that's going to be what's driving our animation. But we'll get to that a little bit later. For scale, bring that down to 2, detail 2, dimension, I'm going to bring that down to 1, leave that at 2. And now we can just grab this first Voronoi and duplicate it, bring it back over here. And for this one, I'm going to do scale 3 and randomness 0.5. Do distance. Now for our color, what we're going to do is we could use uigradients.com to find some cool looking colors for this donut. For my original render, I used this Megatron gradient, which I liked, but let's do something a little different for this tutorial. Some of these are only 2 colors for the gradients, but for this, I found that 3 colors work better. I'll go with this Atlas color. I think this could look cool. So I'm going to bring this off screen, but just keep in mind I'll be pulling these colors for my color ramp. So for my first color, I'll just do that real quick. Now the colors themselves, those don't matter so much. What matters more is actually the placement of these. You could see just by sliding this around a little bit, it's already changing the colors a lot. And I wanted to get some like kind of harsher contrast so the lines are sharper. This is the exact placement on the color ramp that I put my colors. So I'm just gonna, you could just type in the position, but obviously you can experiment and try some different placement out, but this is what worked best for me. So for my first color, it'll be a 0.439. For my middle color, 0.545. And then for my last color, it's 0.7. Cool, so now we can duplicate this color ramp, because we're going to need to make a displacement color ramp using our textures still. So I'll bring that distance down here. And if you go down here, you can reset the color ramp to black and white. For black, we're just going to leave that all the way over to the very left at 0. For the white, we're going to bring that to 0.739. This is the setting I used for my final render. And what this black and white color ramp is doing, we'll bring in a displacement node. We're going to bring that into the height, and then we'll plug in this displacement into the material output displacement node. For mid-level, keep that as is. For strength, I'm going to do 0.055. And to see what this is actually doing, let's go into the cycles render view. And you could see that it's, and actually let's just hit Control Shift Tab on our principled BSDF to see the actual lighting. And now you can see that's actually displacing the textures, so it's giving us those bumps. The lighting is not very good right now, so we're going to change that in a second, but I just wanted you to see what this node is actually doing. And you could see kind of what I was talking about earlier, where since the resolution on this isn't very high, you're seeing a lot of like bumpy, blocky, like mess. If you go back to our modifiers and we bring up this viewport display up to 5, that should clear that out. But obviously 5 levels of resolution is a lot, so it can kind of slow down your computer. And even then, you could kind of see a little bit of blockiness, but it's not too noticeable. And we're going to end up adding some depth of field and everything, so that should smooth some of that out. You could always set that higher in your final render. I just wanted to bring it to 5 so it doesn't take so long to render. But anyway, this scale right here is basically affecting how high the displacement is. So if we were to go up to 1, it would just look insane. Even 0.1 is pretty strong. You could do this if you added enough resolution to the model, but I want it to be a little more subtle, so 0.055 is good for me. Now we could go back to our EV view for now. And actually, let's do one thing. Go to this drop down right here and change it to world. That'll let us change our settings for the HDRI. Hit Control T on that. That'll bring our texture coordinate and mapping nodes. And all I want to do is rotate this on the Z. And I kind of just want to bring it until I'm getting some cool looking specular highlights. Maybe something like that. Let's see the rendered view. It's still a little bright. I'm doing this in the EV view, by the way, just because it renders much faster. So you could do this in cycles view. It's just going to go pretty slow to update. Maybe something like that. Yeah, that's like a bit more dramatic lighting. I think that looks kind of cool. The other thing we can do is go to Film in the Render tab and change this to transparent. Now we can just see our donut. We don't see the background anymore. So finally, let's go back to our object nodes, and we're going to go to this Musgrave texture, and we're going to animate that W now. So let's add in a timeline. If you right click on an edge and hit horizontal split, you could cut that and then turn that into a, if you hit this little drop down, turn that into a timeline. Now we could add some keyframes. So for W on the first frame, just hit I while hovering above it to add a keyframe. And then at 121, let's also hit I. And now at about 60 frames, I'm going to bring that up to 1 and hit I. And that might actually be too fast, so we could watch it right now. And even in this EV view, it is kind of, not kind of, it's very slow. It's only going about 5 to 6 frames per second. But you could now see that the nodes are kind of moving and animating, and they're swapping through the colors on the color ramp. And that is looping perfectly. You could see from the first frame to the last frame, it all connects and loops again. But if you scrub through it, it is moving pretty fast. So you could just do like 0.75 on the 60 frame. That way it's just going to loop through all these colors and then come back down to 0 by the end of the animation to start over again. I would experiment with that a little bit, find something that you think looks good, but this should work for this animation. Let's go back to the layout view now, just so we have a better view of everything. And I'm going to add in a few more lights. Well, by a few more, I'm going to add in some lights. So let's add an area, bring that up. I'm going to change that to from a square, do a disk, go to side view. And one of the things I did in my render was kind of scale this up a little bit and did some like under lighting, rotate that a little bit. And let's go into render view and see how that's affecting it. I think it's kind of giving some of these highlights, but we could turn it on and off to see what that is doing. And then we could bring up our power. So right now it's only at 10. I'm going to bring that up to like 200. And let's rotate that on the Z. Move that around a little bit. If you double tap R and then hold down Shift, you could kind of subtly move it. I think what I'm also going to do is my environment texture. I do like what it's adding, but it's kind of too strong. So let's bring that strength down to, you know what? From what I understand, messing with the strength of an HDRI is actually not the best way to go about that. So let's actually go to color management in the render tab. We could turn down our exposure so it's just not blowing it out so bad. So let's bring this down to like -0.25, maybe even -0.5. And I'm also, while we're here, going to change this look from none to high contrast. Maybe I'll even just go down -1. Okay, so I have this kind of lighting through the donut hole, which I think is looking pretty nice. I might even ramp that up a little more. Let's like say 800, and that's even adding a little rim lighting down here. Now I will go into top view, duplicate that light, and I want a little side lighting. I can make that even tinier, and maybe we'll lower the strength probably, but let's see what that is adding. Cool, yeah, so that's kind of adding right there. Might bring that down to like 650, and maybe I'll give it a little bit of color, like a little blue. And I think I'm just gonna add one more light. So I will take this one again, Shift D, duplicate that, bring it around to the front. Just kind of look at it from all the different angles. And I'm probably going to want to bring this one down quite a bit because it's already getting a decent amount of front lighting. It's just a little dark near the bottom here. And yeah, I don't want to like totally bring all the lighting up here because we want a little bit of contrast in that. So let's go down to like 200. There we go. Keep some of those shadows in there. And I will also give this a little color. And now the last thing we're going to need to do is let's just add in, well, we're going to do a couple things actually. Before we do anything else, let's just go ahead and add some depth of field. So I'm going to bring in one more empty. I'll just do arrows just so we can kind of see it. Scale that up a little bit. And I'm going to rename this to focus. That way I could just find it easier when I'm searching through menus. So go to our camera settings, turn on depth of field, and then for focus object, choose focus. Let's go into rendered view and cycles. And basically now the aperture, the f-stop of our camera is too high to be getting any decent depth of field from this. But when it is lower, we'll be using this focus object to kind of tell the camera where should be the focal point or the in focus point of our scene. So I'm going to bring this down to like 0.2. You can see now this is getting some blur to that. And let's see. Right now, just focusing at the very center point. I'm going to say I'd like to focus kind of up at this back part. Bring that closer a little bit. And the nice thing about using an empty like this is you could actually animate the empty to focus on different things in your shot. so it could kind of rack focus to different objects. I could even like start this out focusing back here and then bring it up so it's focusing on the front part. I don't know, maybe I actually will. Maybe I'll focus on this bottom part. That looks kind of cool. And I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick test render just to see how this is looking. So I'll be right back. Cool, so that's looking okay. You can see with the higher resolution that the displacement is looking smoother. I still think this image might be a little too bright in some areas, so I'm going to tweak the lighting a little bit more. So let's go back into shading view. And I'm going to go back to world view. Maybe something like that. And maybe I'll even bring our exposure down a little bit more, negative 1.25. Go back to layout. Let's see that. Maybe a little too much. I'll just do like negative 1.1. And now it is a little bit dark over here, so I might just tweak the lights real quick. I'm going to bring up the brightness to like 1000. And then for this one, bring that up to like 750. For this, I might actually raise that a little bit. And let's say 350 for that. So yeah, it's getting a lot of shadows like in this middle part, so I'm gonna, let's add a little 3D viewport right here in the bottom. And we're just gonna turn off some of this UI, go into rendered view. And now we can just keep an eye on the lighting while I'm tweaking things in this viewport. So I'm gonna bring this over, maybe like that. Okay, so I think that's a little better. I think once it's in motion, I might do a couple different renders at different points in the animation just to see how it looks, because this is going to take a little while to render out since I'm using cycles. Now that I'm looking at this in the render, I think it might be a little bit too much of an angle, so I'm going to tweak the placement of our donut real quick, and then you can see all these little fireflies, these little white specks in the render. That's basically just because we don't have enough samples right now in our rendering, so I will use some denoising in the final render, and I'll also turn on this adaptive sampling. It should speed it up a little bit, because I'll have to probably crank this up from 256 to like 400 or 512 or something. So I'll go into camera view, and I'm just going to kind of just tweak that a little bit. I will also adjust the placement of our focus. Yeah, I think that helps both with the lighting and just to fill out the frame a little more. I might even just bring this a little bit closer. I want to have a little space on the edges of the frame, but I think that's looking pretty good. Let's see how that looks. Cool. So yeah, let me render out one more frame and then we'll add that background in. Cool, so I think this is looking a lot better with this new placement, rotating the donut a little bit. I think the lighting looks better. I think we're ready to just add in that background and then we can render this out. So what I'm going to do is add in a UV sphere. Go to side view and I will rotate that 90 degrees. I'm just going to scale that up quite a bit. You go into edit mode, wireframe view, and then we can box select the whole front of that. Just delete the vertices. And what I will do, I'll probably move that back just a little bit. Hit Control 2 to add a subdivision surface modifier, and then shade smooth. And we can add in, we'll just call this background for the material. And right now, it's, not really doing much for us. So what we will do is go into the shading tab, object. I'm going to actually collapse this. We do join areas, and then I'll give you a little arrow. I'll do point down to collapse that down to give us more space. I'm going to also collapse that. So for our background material, I'm going to actually grab this orange color from our gradient for the donut. And what I'll actually probably end up doing is hit Control T on this, delete that image texture, and I'm just going to want a gradient texture and then a color ramp. It's the factor. And then that can go into the base color. So for one of the colors, for the black, I will just use that orange, and I'll do the same thing for the white, but then I will tweak that a little bit. Maybe I'll make it a little more saturated, make it a little darker. For specular, I'm going to bring that way down, like 0.1. Turn up the roughness even more. I don't really want any like reflections or anything in the background. I just kind of want like a nice gradient. So we're going to do a couple things. We could change the texture coordinate to generated. And then from linear, we could tweak these. Easing sometimes looks a little softer. I'm going to actually rotate. I kind of want the darkness to be a little bit lower, so it's a little brighter in the top, darker in the bottom. And then let's take a look at that. Maybe a little too dark on that color. So I will brighten that up a little bit. And as you can see, this is actually getting lighting from the scene, and I don't especially want that either. So what I can do to fix that, so what we can do is delete this principled BSDF node, bring in a emission shader, and plug that right into there, and then we'll need a transparent shader and a mix shader. I think it'll be the emission in the bottom, transparent in the top, and then we will also add in a light path node. And what we need is the is camera. And basically what that does is turns that into a shadeless material. So now our background layer is unaffected by any lighting, shadows, anything like that. It's just going to give us that color gradient for the background, which is basically all I wanted it for. I don't need it to be adding any lighting to our donut. So I will go ahead and render that out real quick, see how that looks. Cool, so yeah, I think that works okay. I might tweak the gradient a little bit more. I might give it 3 colors. So we could just be in, well, let's look at it in fully rendered view. What we could do to stop it from trying to render everything in cycles view, so you hit Control B, draw a box around your camera view, and now it's only rendering what's within that square. So I'm going to add in one more color node on here. I'm going to make that a bit brighter, and I'll turn down the saturation just so it's a little lighter. And now I'm just going to be tweaking these values. I think now that I've gotten the shadeless look working a little better, I'm going to darken it in the bottom again. So I am pretty happy with this, I think. So what I'm going to do is just set up some render settings for us and render this out. And I will be back in probably about an hour to see how it turns out. Before I do a final render though, I just want to do a test render with the final settings to make sure it's going to look how I want it. I'll turn that up to 5. Let's try 400 actually. Just the fewer samples we could get away with, the better, just for speed. I'll turn on adaptive sampling, which basically the idea here is if you hover over it, it gives you a little box about what it does. It basically reduces the number of samples per pixel based on how noisy it thinks that pixel is going to be based on the available light. I've generally found it does save a reasonable amount of time, and it doesn't really affect render quality. Sometimes, depending on what you're rendering, if it's a really dark scene, you will notice some worse results from that, but this should be okay. And then for denoising, I'm going to turn on optics because I have an NVIDIA card. And let's just render this out. I'm going to find an interesting looking frame. That looks kind of cool. So I will render this out real quick. All right, so that actually looks pretty good. Took a little over a minute. It's pretty smooth. It doesn't look too soft from the denoising. I think the only thing I want to tweak really is the placement of the camera. It has a little bit too much room up here, and this is pretty close to the bottom. So I'm just gonna readjust the camera. And yeah, other than that, I think we're good to go. So what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna collapse this. I'm just gonna save this out as a JPEG sequence. All right, so I'm gonna render this out now and I'll be right back. Cool, so that is the final result of the tutorial. I think this one turned out pretty well. I hope you learned some stuff in this one. Obviously, displacement could be a very useful tool in Blender. You can do a lot of really cool stuff with this, and you could use any of the procedural texture nodes to create this displacement effect, so you could get a lot of different looks with it. And on top of that, you could use the displacement modifier with a bunch of different procedural textures to get even more cool procedural animation. So make sure to experiment with that. Make sure to check me out on Instagram at ThomasLatvies3D. It's where I post my newest art and links to new tutorials. And if you guys follow my tutorials and tag me in your post, I will share it in my story. If you guys are enjoying my tutorials and you're looking for a way to support me, consider checking me out on Patreon, where depending on the tier you support, you'll have access to high-res downloads of my renders and animations, early access to my tutorials, project files, and you'll get to vote on potential future tutorials I record. Other than that, thanks for watching, guys. See you next time.